British wrestling has produced a lot of loud personalities, big men, hard men, men who wanted you to hate them. But Jackie Paulo wasn't disliked because he was brutal or violent or out of control. Jackie Paulo was disliked because he was clever, outspoken, and deeply convinced he was the smartest person in the room. He was a television star, a master of irritation, and later, the man who wrote a book that said things British wrestling had survived on by not saying out loud. I'm Josh Faulkner, and this is the story of Jackie Paulo. Jackie Paulo was born Jack Ernest Duttridge on the 12th of January 1926 in Islington, North London. Pallo was born into a boxing family, and that detail tells you a lot. He grew up around fighters, trainers, gym talk, and discipline. Before wrestling, he boxed. He trained seriously, and from early on, he didn't see combat sports as chaos. He saw them as something you could understand and manipulate. It was that mindset that would shape his entire career for reasons both good and bad. Turning his attention to wrestling, Pallo entered the professional ranks and by the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s became almost unavoidable on British television, especially through ITV's coverage of professional wrestling as part of the show World of Sport. He appeared so often that he earned the nickname Mr. TV. Pallo's matches followed a familiar pattern: endless arguing with referees, tiny rule breaks that drove crowds mad, stepping out of the ring repeatedly, and long pauses where nothing happened, all by design. He didn't want cheers, he wanted groans, and he was brilliant at getting them. If Jackie Paulo had an arch rival, it was Mick McManus. Their rivalry became one of the defining feuds of British wrestling. The peak came on FA Cup Final Day 1963 when Pallo and McManus faced off in a televised bout from Wembley that was watched by 16 million viewers. That's not hyperbole. People chose to watch two wrestlers over the biggest football match of the year. McManus was the hard, uncompromising enforcer. Pallo was the clever irritant who slowed everything down. It was a perfect clash, and one of the most important rivalries British wrestling has ever produced. Despite his fame, Jackie Paulo wasn't a prolific champion. In fact, his only major title reign came late, a short run as British heavy middleweight champion in 1969 after defeating Burt Royal on the 21st of April. But championships weren't why Paulo stayed on top. His value was television reliability, crowd reaction, and psychology. He didn't need belts to be indispensable. Behind the curtain, Jackie Paulo was difficult, not violent, not unpredictable, just dismissive. Many wrestlers later described him as condescending, intellectually superior in his own mind, and uninterested in dressing room camaraderie. He believed most wrestlers didn't understand psychology, didn't understand audiences, and were repeating habits without thinking. And crucially, he didn't keep those opinions to himself. By the early 1970s, Pallo had lived a full wrestling life, so when he announced an autobiography, You Grunt, I'll Groan, most fans expected harmless nostalgia, but that is not what they got. The book openly described wrestling as a worked performance, explained how matches were structured, talked about psychology and crowd control, and treated promoters and traditions with thinly disguised contempt. The tone that mattered. It wasn't reflective, it wasn't apologetic, it was smug. Pallo positioned himself as the clever one, the man who saw through the business, and someone surrounded by fools. If the book existing was bad enough, what came next was worse. Large sections of You Grunt, I'll Groan were serialized in the news of the world. This wasn't a niche wrestling publication. This was a mass-circulated Sunday tabloid with millions of readers. British wrestling didn't rely on people believing it was real. It relied on not rubbing faces in how it worked. That was the betrayal. Not that Pallo exposed wrestling, but that he did it publicly, profitably, and without concern for the fallout. After that, Jackie Paulo was never viewed the same way by his peers again. Doors didn't slam shut. They just quietly stopped opening. In a move that shocked many fans, Pallo later left Joint Promotions, where he'd been a mainstay for 25 years and a television wrestler since broadcast began. He broke away and formed Pallo Enterprises alongside his son Jackie Jr. He billed himself as the star who presents the stars, and for a while, he was justified. He ran strong shows across Britain and came close to securing the ITV wrestling contract in the early 1980s, something that would have rewritten history. But his weakness wasn't wrestling, it was business. Many believe his commercial skills lagged behind his matchmaking instincts. After ITV dropped wrestling in 1988, Pallo made one last push. WAW, no, not the current Norwich-based outfit, but a promotion started by Pallo and standing for Wrestling Around the World, was formed specifically to bring wrestling back to television. It was ambitious, it was determined, but ultimately, it was a commercial failure. And that was effectively the end of Jackie Paulo's wrestling world. Away from wrestling, Pallo lived quietly with his family in Ramsgate, Kent. He died of cancer in 2006 at the age of 80. Jackie Paulo never apologized, and he never stopped believing he was right. Jackie Paulo wasn't easy to like, but he was impossible to ignore. He entertained millions, he infuriated colleagues, and he told the truth before the business was ready to survive it. That's not a villain story, that's a human one.